And welcome to Psalm 73. We're all in for a treat. I mean, every day when I get to present, I come to it with renewed appreciation and surprise by the distinctiveness of the psalm before us. This morning's psalm, Psalm 73, Martin Buber, the great Bible scholar and theologian, called his favorite psalm. Here's what Martin Buber said of this psalm. What is it that so draws me to this poem that is pieced together out of description, report, and confession, and draws me ever more strongly the older I become? I think it is this, that here a person reports how he attained to the true purpose of his life experience, and this sense touches me, and this sense touches directly on the eternal. And Martin Buber would also note that the most repeated word in this psalm is the word heart, lev, verses 1, 7, 13, 21, and 26, in that this is a poem of self-reflection. This psalm is not found in the liturgy. This is a wisdom psalm, not a prayer. Rather, this psalm, with remarkable honesty, wrestles with the question, why do bad people prosper? Which is not unique, of course, to this psalm. We find Jeremiah 12:1. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? And you get some of that in Job as well. The sense that as you at least look at the world, you do not see God administering justice. Here, there's a contrast between what the psalmist sees and the doubts and temptation to follow the wicked, and the difference between seeing verse 3 and verse 17, avina, I have grown to understand. And I'm going to flag this so I don't forget to emphasize it. There's a turning point in this psalm, verse 17, and that is, until I came into the sanctuaries of Ale, then I understood what would be their end. And it's in the plural. It's sanctuaries. And I want to focus in on what commentators do and don't do with that. Most translations translate it in the singular, until I came into the holy sanctuary. And that's the turning point. But in the Hebrew, and you'll see this even in the Art Scroll, because they try to be true to the Hebrew, it's in the plural. What's that about? Not so clear. But what is clear is that the frame of this particular psalm are two words. Good, that'll be in the first and last verse, the word good, and the name of God, but a different name of God in the opening verse and in the closing verse. So let me post it and share with you. I've been tweaking here to the last moment as I continue to think about this psalm. I'm going to read something also so I don't forget it. Here's an example of what Robert Alter says about verse 10 as an example. I'll put verse 10, but I will acknowledge that this is a hard psalm to translate, and I'll give examples how differently this psalm gets read. But any translation, verse 10, this is Robert Alter, of this verset and the next is guesswork, because the Hebrew is not intelligible. So you'll see that the Hebrew is hard to translate. Okay, I chose to I always, again, I've gotten this rhythm that the titles that I pick are a phrase from the psalm that I feel is the key focus of the psalm. This title is from verse 3. For I envied the decadent, peacefulness of the wicked I saw. The word baholalim, I translate decadent. I also found that translation in, interestingly, a Chabad Psalm, Book of Tehillim, which is their translation. But just to show you how subject these, because it's poetry and they're often obscure words, Robert Alter and Steinsaltz both translated as revelers. Richard Levy and Rosenberg and Slotowitz translated as boastful ones. Benjamin Siegel, wanton ones. Martin Cohen, debauched, which is only to say, in English, there are many words for what in Hebrew is more limited in vocabulary. And in Hebrew, often with the choice of poetic words, there's not a lot of concordance to find out a consistent translation. All right, I focus on that since it's the title. I liked Decadent, and you'll see why, because I think it describes well his description. And his description of these decadent will include kind of a satire on how obese they are, how they don't, it's, hyperbole in terms of even in death, there doesn't seem to be suffering. They don't labor like the rest of us. Let me begin. A psalm of Asaph. Surely good to Israel is God, to the pure of heart. But as for me, my feet had almost strayed in an instant. My steps had nearly tumbled, for I envied the decadent. Peacefulness of the wicked I saw, for there are no fetters at their death, and their health is sound. Theirs is no mortal labor, and along with humankind they are not plagued. Therefore their necklace is pride, violence enwraps them like a cloak. Their eyes bulge from fatness, overflowing are the chambers of their hearts. They scoff and speak of wickedness, of oppression, from on high they speak. They set against heaven their mouth, and their tongue parades across the land. Therefore, God's people retreat yonder, and waters of fullness are wrung from them. And they say, how does God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these wicked and always at ease have attained power. Surely in vain I have purified my heart and washed clean my palms, being that I have been plagued all day and am chastised every morning. If I had said, I will tell it as it is, behold, generation of your children, I would have betrayed. And when I pondered to understand this, it was laborious in my eyes. Until I came into the sanctuaries of El, then I understood what would be their end. Surely, upon slippery places you set them, you hurl them down to utter ruin. How they become a desolation in a moment. They are finished, swept away by terrors, as a dream upon awakening, my supreme. In the city, their appearance you make despised. For embittered is my heart and my conscience pierced. But as for me, a boor unknowing as cattle I was with you. But as for me, always with you, you hold my right hand. With your counsel you guide me, and toward glory you take me. Whom else is to me in heaven? Being with you, I do not desire anything upon earth. Though spent are my flesh and heart, my heart's rock and my portion is God forever. For behold, those far from you will perish. You demolish all who go whoring from you. As for me, nearness of God is my good. I have set my supreme Adonai, my refuge, to tell of your works. Now, the trajectory in the end here overlaps with Psalm 72 yesterday. You may recall in 72, the psalmist finds his purpose, and that purpose is to declare, that's the Psalm 72 of his aging. And he asks God not to cast him off into old age, but to preserve him so that he can go and tell of God's strength, the Zeroah, God's arm, to the next generation. And in this Psalm too, there's the sense that the psalmist feels a responsibility to convey morality to the next generation. And more, that the psalmist has a purpose in proclaiming and telling of God's works, whatever those works might be. But here, for this psalm, the key word is with, meaning the shift for this psalmist is feeling himself with God. Verse 28. Verse 23, but as for me, always with you, you hold my right hand. With your counsel, you guide me, and toward glory you take me. The shift here is being with you. Verse 25. Whom else is to me in heaven? Being with you, I do not desire anything upon earth or anything else upon earth. The notion here is that the change from seeing to understanding is the experience of being with God. So what causes this change? Now verse 17. Verse 15, if I had said, I will tell it, I'm going to change this in a moment. If I will tell it like it is, behold, generations of your children I would have betrayed. Meaning, if I was to tell what I see, well, I would betray them. For, they scoff and speak of wickedness. Verse 8, of oppression from on high they speak. They set against heaven their mouth, and their tongue parades across the land, meaning they are arrogant in how they use speech. They have no fear of God. Verse 11, they say, how does God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Which is the ultimate condemnation of the wicked. Namely, they have no sense of accountability for their wrongdoings because they assert there is no one who watches, no one who knows. They scoff. They wear their pride like a necklace around them. They enwrap themselves in violence. So I'm looking for the word see, which is verse 3. For I envied the decadent, peacefulness of the wicked I saw. So the first part of this psalm is an honest appraisal of what is real in the world. In the world, arrogant, selfish people are often successful. They seem to live very well. They eat well. They seem to even be peaceful. Here in verse 3, for I envied the decadent, shalom risha'im er'eh. I saw the peacefulness of their lives. And that is what is remarkable about this psalm, is that there is this quality of honesty. An important Christian commentator on Psalms, Brueggemann, will say what this represents is this quality of honesty that leads to an evolved complex faith that overcomes what the speaker sees, leading to a second knowing, naivete, quoting Paul Ricoeur, which is to say the journey of this psalm is from seeing the world and knowing that all his efforts to cleanse himself, to purify himself, seem to be misguided because the evil prosper. And then this turning point. So verse 17, until I came into the sanctuaries of El. We've seen this word for God, El. It's a generic term. It's not Yud He Vav He, which will be the punchline of the psalm, or even Elohim. It's related. Elohim is multiple El, and it's in the plural. So why? So, most of the translations duck the question. So in the King James Version, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. And that's true for most of my translations, because when we think of a Jew in the ancient world in biblical Israel, the sacred space was the Holy Temple. It's in the singular. Well, as I noted, ArtScroll will translate it in the plural because it is in the plural. And remarkably, if you've gotten, this morning we begin the second volume of the ArtScroll. It's a very big book. It's over 1,750 pages, meaning they put in a lot of commentaries into these books. Here, as to why it's in the plural, they don't cite any of the medieval commentators. It's not until the 19th century that Samson Raphael Hirsch is used here to say in the sanctuary there were many chambers. That's why it's put into the plural, because it was a multi-spaced place. Though Robert Alter says something interesting to me. Maybe it's interesting to me because it reflects my own experience, which is to say, it wasn't that the sanctuaries could include pagan sanctuaries. That so that's what he says, and now I will provide a commentary. When I have gone into certain sanctuaries of people around the world, what I've often seen is what appears to me to be magic. Lots of, fortune tellers out front and bringing of food offerings to gods to curry favor in the uncertainties of life. And for me, at least, in my own exploration of comparative religions on the ground, in terms of folk religions, not the purified Houston Smith description of the wisdom of religions, but the lived religions on the ground around the world, I've often encountered, including in Judaism, frankly, in some places, but this quality of magic that has turned me off to that pursuit. And so that's what Robert Alter says, that in calling this Mikdashe El, it could include having gone into pagan places also. Richard Levy, as a religious commentator who was, as I've noted, the head of the Reform movement, rabbinical school in Los Angeles, has a wonderful commentary on Psalms. And in his commentary to this Psalm, Psalm 73, he picks up on the plural, not directly, but in his, why is this relevant to me analysis of this Psalm, will say we can encounter God in nature, in family and friends. We can have holy moments that give us those goosebumps. I'm adding the goosebumps and the wow. But his suggestion is it's in the plural, in that until I came into the sanctuaries of El means until I had holy moments. And that can be in many places, and that resonates for me. And again, I don't see that in any of the other translation commentaries until Richard Levy. but it makes a lot of sense in terms of my own spiritual worldview, and one that clearly resonates in seeing this through Martin Buber's eyes. Martin Buber, the 19th century into the 20th century German Jewish Bible scholar, who, by the way, was the son of a leading Bible scholar. His father had been an important collector of midrashim. Martin Buber, the philosopher, had at the center of his philosophy the notion of I, thou. That where is it that we encounter the divine? It's when we are in relationship with another person or with nature. Wherever we lose our sense of self and have a sense of self, but the relationship is not a user relationship, but simply encounter for its own sake. Hence the thou with a capital T, seeing the other as self-contained, and God exists in the in-between, or I should say the holy is in the in-between of an I and a thou, in a encounter of myself with the greater presence of another, honoring the other without any agenda. And as I noted, the trajectory here, for embittered is my heart, my conscience pierced. By the way, conscience is translated because it's kidneys. In the ancient world, klayot are kidneys, and they were understood to be where conscience resides. In contrast to lev. Lev wasn't only heart as we use it. Lev is knowingness. Maybe because when the heart beats more quickly, we're made aware. So heart throughout the Bible is both the heart feelings, but also knowingness. But as for me, abur, unknowing, as cattle I was with you. And here it's in the plural also. And again, what the psalmist does is purposeful in terms of singulars and plurals. And I surmise in verse 22 that he refers to himself as cattle to say, before he was going with the crowd. And it's a shift because bur and unknowing are in the singular, and then it shifts to the plural. As cattle I was with you. And then 3 times in this psalm, you have this expression, va'ani, but as for me. 4 times, verse 2, 23, 22, 23, and 28. And these are the turning points. 23, verse 22, but as for me, a bur, a knowing, a cattle as I was with you. That's then, and then now. But as for me, always with you, you hold my right hand. With your counsel, you guide me, and toward glory, you take me. So, va'achar kavod tikacheni seems to be, you take me to you. Now, here again, back to translations. King James, verse 24, though I've seen this in Jewish translations too, like in the Art Scroll. Listen to King James for 24. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. That translation points to the afterlife. Afterwards you will receive me to glory, playing on the word achar, which I here translate as toward. The notion that this points to an afterlife is clearly an interpretation. Robert Alter, who highlights this, will say that in the Bible itself, particularly in Psalms, there is very little focus on the afterlife in text and in theory, and that's really a gloss, a choice of taking the word and pointing it to the future as an afterlife. Afterward, receive me to glory, meaning into heaven. So there too, I'm always fascinated by how translations are interpretations and are grounded. I mean, there's ambiguity in these words, and it's done with the lens we all bring to our own reading and the humility we must have in the reading of a text. And so, closing, because I have an eye on the clock, we're almost at 10. Who is Asaph? We've seen Asaph before, and we'll see more of him. We'll see a lot of him. He'll be at the beginning now of our third book a number of times. Other than King David, he's the most identified name in Psalms. And you find him also in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 16, where David appoints the Levites under Asaph to quote, to invoke, praise, and extol God. And in that chapter, which describes King David bringing the Holy Ark from Shiloh to Jerusalem, Asaph is described, singled out as playing the cymbals in celebration. And so Asaph is a Levite. The Levites were the ones who had this responsibility in the temple to be a choir, to be a orchestra with instruments. For the idea was that worship was enhanced by music and song and poetry. And the Psalms that we read are the playbook of those Levites, though this psalm is not meant to be liturgy. This psalm distinctly is a description of an individual and his, that being of the nature of the time period, his journey of faith. And I will point out that even after going to the temple, there is still a, I'm just looking for, verse 22 that we looked at. That's afterwards. But as for me, a boor, knowing as cattle I was with you, there's still a kind of vacillating. Verse 26, though spent are my flesh and heart, my heart's rock and my portion is God forever. And so there is what is called in common theology today a second naivete. Stephen Covey wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he said there's 3 dimensions of knowledge. There is simplistic, there is complex, and then there is the simple. Simplistic is black or white. Complex sees all these variables, but the higher level of knowing is distilling the essence. And that's done through having acknowledged complexity. And that you hold on to is the essence of wisdom. And so this is such a journey from seeing black or white to acknowledging and seeing complexity, to knowing that to be with God, to have holy moments, is to know that what endures and is of value because it is both essential and enduring is the sense of being with the holy more than being with physicality. For physicality is transient, including riches and even power, but being with the divine, being with a sense of a goodness, the opening and closing words. And last, it opens with good and has a closing acknowledging God is my good. And then in verse 28, I have set and appearing for the first time is the Yud He Vav He, Adonai Elohim, the supreme Adonai as my refuge, to tell of your works, a journey that leads to the intimacy of being with God, a religious reflection. With that, with 10 o'clock straight up, there's so much more I could say, and I look to say it with your promptings. So I now turn to you. I know some had to leave early today to say, let me listen. What, Julia waves goodbye. It was a treat to have Julia with us. What are some thoughts you might have about Psalm 73? What I didn't spend a lot of time doing is unpacking some of those images of the wicked, of the decadent. Listen to this one, for instance, verse 7. Their eyes bulge with fatness. Overflowing are the chambers of their hearts is the literal translation, which I relied on in some part on Adin Steinsaltz, in terms of maskiyot being chambers, but it's often translated, which is what is implied, which is overflowing are the fantasies of their heart, even more than, their fantasies, even more than they would have initially imagined. So there's a lot of description here that is metaphor. And again, they're so corpulent, they're so fat, it's almost as if their eyes are shut because they're bulging, because they're just so corpulent that their eyes are overcased with fat. So there's a lot of satire, if you will, hyperbole in describing both the peacefulness and the opulence, the power of the decadent. All right, some reactions to Psalm 73. Ahuva, always a treat. Go ahead, Ahuva. Unmute yourself.
Concerning the verse 17, I checked with Ibn Ezra.
Yes.
And he said something very interesting. He reads Mikdashei El not as buildings, but as those who operate in the temple. So these are the Kohanim, these are Leviim. So until I come to the Kohanim, to the priests who are Mekudshei El, read it, just change the vowels. Instead of Mikdashei, read it Mekudshei.
Nice.
And then it says, I will understand their thoughts.
And then it leads to his condemnation, I assume, in verse. So he seems, from what you're describing, Ibn Ezra. I'll add for everybody, Ibn Ezra, an important biblical commentator, Avam Ibn Ezra, 1089 to 1167 in Spain, Tudela to Calahorra. And he is particularly adept at understanding, or what his focus was, is the pshat, the plain meaning of Hebrew. But in this case, as Ahuva points out, he has to change the literal Hebrew. So instead of being as written, Mekadshe, he adds Mekudshe, which means the holy ones of, instead of the holiness of. So this is the holy ones. Would that lead Ahuva to the next line? Surely upon slippery places you set them, you hurl them down to utter ruin. Would that be in reference to the priests?
No, not at all.
Oh, so explain. Go ahead.
These are people who are he goes back to what he said before that, all the evil people.
I see.
So he goes back to them.
I see. Thank you for the clarification. So he's saying what transformed him was encountering the Kohanim.
Yeah.
Rather than his own, if you will, divine experience. Now, I'll just say, again, I value you pointing out and bringing to the foreground Ibn Ezra's understanding, which interestingly did not get included in the Art Scroll, which often looks to Ibn Ezra. I think there was a tension around it. But this notion of transformation by being with God, that has a history also in the biblical text. So in Job, we've talked about this before. It was Job's experience of God addressing Job that seems to be the transformation for Job, of letting go of his doubts. More than anything God said, it's being with God. And here, at least what will get repeated over and over is this phrase with God, as his unfolding. But I value, thank you, Ahuva, for bringing in another example of how translations are interpretations. And in this case, often the Hebrew is obscure and warrants changing but one letter to make another understanding. Other reactions to Psalm 73?
Well, if no one has anything else to say,
Go ahead, Richard. You always are valuable to hear. Go ahead.
what I have to say here is kind of, well, it's a personal approach, or how this psalm hit me, if you will, as I first read it this morning, just before the we got together. I read through it. It was almost a little fearfulness that came out of it, that I might find myself either in the place of the decadent, not realizing it, and or being in the place of someone who envied the decadent. And I have to confess, there have been times, like, I think that, as I've looked around and seen others seemingly prosper, as this psalm talks about, and found myself in a little bit of resentment. However, at the end, and I very much appreciate it, as the psalm concludes, there's this, what would you call it, this barrier to that, the solution to it, if you will, and very much resonates with that. Anyway, that's my comment.
Well, thank you. So let me react to that, Richard. And that's to say, what you brought to the foreground in an honest way is that there's an element here in reading this psalm of being reminded of our own natural envy and even fearfulness of that envy, of knowing that the reality is we see people that we see as decadent who seem to be thriving. And we who seem to choose integrity, not shortcuts, but the longer path of integrity, sometimes don't prosper so readily. I'm reminded of the Dalai Lama, who I once heard speak to a group of business people at UCI. It was a smaller group. It was a privilege. It was like 50 people in an audience that were invited to be with him on one of his UCI visits. And he laughed and he said to these business people, that was the focus. He said, we Tibetans aren't known for being successful in business, he said, I don't know of a single Tibetan millionaire. So he said, I think to myself, who am I to be talking to business people about business? Because I'm not very, personally adept at business. He said, but here's the one thing I'd want to share with you that I know from my life, that those who respond or seek immediate goals and do it by shortcuts will also often do it at the price of their reputation, and in the long run will suffer. That if as a business you want to prosper for the long trajectory, you have to do it with integrity. And that was the key. That was his message. I'm putting it into my own words. And I think that's a piece of this, because throughout Psalms, this notion of what will happen to the people who now prosper, the sense is that it's transient, that ultimately they're going to fall into their own pit. That's what we've seen before. And there's an element of that here, that ultimately what looks in this moment, what the snapshot of this moment is not the bigger picture. That's part A. And that might even include the afterlife. But part B is what really is the possession that matters is faith. The sense that it's a good world and that morality matters to a caring God, that God does see. To live a life unlike the scoffers that say how we live now matters in terms of integrity to God, to live with that faith and more, to have encountered goosebumps of holiness, of belonging and part of God's presence. That is what gives ultimately life meaning. And at the end of the day, that's that which is valuable. And I love this line, which is, if I had told it like it is, meaning I would have betrayed the next generation. Meaning, if I had been honest and really said what I was struggling with as truth, which is the wicked prosper, and that's just real, I would have betrayed them because I'm not sure that it is real with a capital R. For I've, in this long-going life journey, learned that what really matters is our integrity, our sense of knowing that what we do matters to a caring creator and more to ourselves, and that being in the presence of a caring creator, to be with God, is at the essence of what is good. And last, here, like Psalm 72, the purpose we then gain is seeing ourselves as part of a larger people, which gets hinted at here. It's not only our personal wrestle, but our wrestle on behalf of others. And that what we say to the next generation matters in terms of conveying our truths to create a world in God's image. Well, that's a long riff, but a riff that feels motivated by, the notions of Martin Buber. I'll close with Vivian's comment in the chat. Thank you for the Martin Buber I thou, looking for something for the first night of Hanukkah with grandchildren. That's exactly it. Well, I'm delighted. And I'm delighted, Vivian, that you'll be with grandchildren, because in 73 is this notion that we are guides for the generations after us. With that, I thank you for Psalm 73 together. Next week, we'll reach the halfway point of Psalms, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 74, 75, middle point, 76. Have a good Hanukkah tonight. Tonight is candle number 1. Happy Hanukkah.
Yes.
And, many miracles for each of us as we move forward in life. We wait for the shot as the miracles will yet unfold.
Kaddish, Rabbi.
Oh,
Rabbi Kaddish.
Mimi, without you, I don't know what I would do. I would miss.
Mimi, you're an angel.
All right, today on the Aramaic side, we conclude with the opportunity to answer Amen as we recite Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute v'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran bi'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen.
Amen.
And happy Hanukkah, Chag Urim v'Sameach, which in Hebrew is happy holiday of lights. So, be well. Enjoy.